The temperature outside had dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and Utqiagvik lay buried under a blanket of snow so thick that even the streetlights looked like dying stars through the white veil. The old wooden church creaked in the wind, but this was different. This was the sound of intrusion, of something forcing its way into the sacred space he had protected for over 2 decades. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs as he slowly rose from the front pew, his knees protesting after hours of prayer. The candlelight flickered across the simple altar, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with anticipation. Another sound, heavy breathing, ragged and desperate. Not human breathing. Something larger, something wild. The priest's mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Had someone broken in? Was this an attack? In 23 years serving this remote congregation, he had never faced anything like this. The breathing grew closer, accompanied by the scrape of claws against wooden floors. Thomas caught sight of a massive shadow moving between the pews, a hulking silhouette that seemed to fill the narrow aisle. His blood turned to ice water as he realized what he was looking at. The shadow paused, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, predator and priest faced each other in the flickering candlelight. The figure was enormous, easily 7 feet tall even on all fours, with breath that rose like steam in the frigid air. Thomas had seen many dangerous things in his life before taking his vows, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The creature's breathing was labored, almost painful to hear, and there was something in its posture that spoke not of aggression, but of something else entirely, something that made the hair on his arms stand on end for reasons he couldn't yet understand. If this already caught your attention, make sure to subscribe. The real reason she entered will leave you speechless. Utqiagvik stands at the very edge of America, the northernmost city in the United States, where the Arctic Ocean meets a landscape so harsh that winter stretches for 8 months of the year. Here, where the sun disappears for 65 days straight, a small wooden church serves as the only beacon of warmth and faith for nearly 5,000 souls scattered across the frozen tundra. The Church of the Northern Light had weathered 47 Alaskan winters, its timber darkened by decades of ice storms and blizzards. The building leaned slightly to the east, battered by relentless Arctic winds, but it stood firm against nature's assault. Inside, rough-hewn pews faced a simple altar adorned with a hand-carved wooden cross that caught the light from oil lamps and candles. The walls were lined with donated blankets and emergency supplies, making the church not just a place of worship, but a shelter for anyone caught in the merciless weather. Father Thomas Ellery had arrived in Utqiagvik 23 years earlier, a broken man seeking redemption in the most isolated place he could find. Born in Montana, he had spent his youth as a hunter and trapper, following the family tradition that stretched back 4 generations. But something had happened in those mountains, something that drove him to hang up his rifle and pick up a Bible instead. At 61, Thomas was lean and weathered like the church itself, his gray hair thinning but his blue eyes still sharp enough to spot movement across the tundra. His hands, scarred from years of outdoor work, were surprisingly gentle when he comforted the grieving or blessed the sick. The people of Utqiagvik respected him not just as their spiritual leader, but as someone who understood their harsh reality. His daily routine was simple but meaningful: morning prayers at sunrise, visits to the elderly and sick, maintenance of the church building, and evening services for whoever braved the cold to attend. Most nights he prayed alone, his voice echoing in the empty sanctuary as wind howled outside. The solitude never bothered him. He had chosen this life, this penance, this opportunity to serve something greater than himself. But tonight was different. Tonight, the silence he had grown to love was shattered by the arrival of something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about faith, forgiveness, and the thin line between the civilized and the wild. As he stared at the massive shadow before him, Thomas realized that his quiet life was about to change forever. The priest's first instinct was to retreat, to grab the hunting rifle he kept locked in the vestry for emergencies exactly like this. His feet moved backward instinctively, muscle memory from his hunting days telling him to create distance between himself and the predator. But as he took that first step back, something made him pause. The bear, for that's what it clearly was, a massive female polar bear, wasn't advancing. She lay sprawled beside the altar, her enormous head resting on the wooden floor, sides heaving with each labored breath. Her usually pristine white fur was matted and stained, marked with dirt, and what looked like old blood along her shoulder. This was no aggressive predator ready to attack. This was a creature in distress. Thomas had encountered polar bears before during his early years in Alaska. He knew their power, their unpredictability, their capacity for both beauty and violence. But this bear was different. As she lifted her massive head to look at him, her dark eyes held something he had never seen in a wild animal before, not just exhaustion or pain, but what looked almost like surrender. She didn't growl or show her teeth. She didn't rear up on her hind legs or make any of the threatening displays he had been taught to fear. Instead, she simply watched him, her breathing shallow and rapid, as if the effort of breaking into the church had taken the last of her strength. The priest's hand was halfway to the vestry door when he stopped completely. Something in those dark eyes made him reconsider everything. Years of hunting had taught him to read animals, to understand their body language and intentions. This bear wasn't here to hunt or to establish territory. She was here for the same reason people came to his church. She was seeking sanctuary. The realization hit him like a physical blow. How many times had he preached about welcoming the lost and desperate? How many sermons had he given about providing shelter to those who had nowhere else to turn? And now, faced with the most unlikely parishioner he could ever imagine, was he going to reach for a gun? The bear's eyes followed his movement toward the vestry, and Thomas swore he saw a flicker of fear pass through them. Not the fear of a cornered predator, but the fear of someone who had already given up hope and was waiting for the final blow. It was an expression he had seen too many times in the faces of his human congregation, the look of someone who had reached the absolute end of their strength. Thomas let his hand fall to his side. Whatever had brought this magnificent creature to his door, whatever desperation had driven her to break into the one place in Utqiagvik that should have been completely alien to her wild nature, he wasn't going to meet it with violence. Not tonight. Not when everything about her posture spoke of a soul, and yes, he was beginning to think of her as having a soul, in need of mercy. What would you do in a moment like this? Would you help her? Or protect yourself? Tell me in the comments below. As Thomas stood frozen in indecision, his mind traveled back 32 years to a moment that had changed the entire trajectory of his life. He was 29 then, an experienced hunter tracking through the Montana wilderness with his father and uncle, continuing a family tradition that had put food on their table for generations. They had been following a female grizzly for 3 days, drawn by the promise of a substantial pelt and enough meat to last through winter. Thomas was the best tracker in his family, able to read signs that others missed, to predict an animal's movements with uncanny accuracy. When they finally cornered the bear in a narrow canyon, he was the one who took the shot. It was only after she fell that they discovered she had been protecting 2 cubs hidden in a nearby cave. The sight of those orphaned babies, barely old enough to survive on their own, had shattered something inside Thomas. He could still remember their confused whimpering, the way they nudged their mother's still body, trying to wake her. His family had assured him it was just nature, just survival, just the way things had always been. But Thomas couldn't shake the image of those cubs, couldn't forget the look in the mother's eyes in her final moments. Not hatred or anger, but a desperate love for the babies she was trying to protect. That night changed everything. He stopped hunting, stopped trapping, eventually left Montana altogether to find some way to make amends for what felt like a cosmic debt. The priesthood wasn't just a calling. It was penance, a way to spend the rest of his life protecting and nurturing instead of taking and destroying. Now, staring at another bear mother in distress, Thomas felt the weight of that old guilt settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. Was this coincidence? Was this some kind of divine test? Or was this simply the universe giving him a chance to respond differently than he had all those years ago? The bear's breathing had grown even more labored, and Thomas noticed she was favoring her left side, as if something was seriously wrong. This wasn't just exhaustion from traveling across the tundra. She was injured, possibly dying, and for reasons he couldn't explain, she had chosen his church as the place to make her final stand. He took a step forward, then another, watching her reaction carefully. She didn't move, didn't even lift her head, just continued that steady, pained breathing. Thomas realized he was no longer afraid. Whatever happened next, he wasn't going to let fear make his decisions. Not this time. Instead of retreating to get his rifle, Thomas moved slowly toward the supply closet where the church kept emergency blankets and provisions. If this bear was going to die, she wasn't going to die cold and alone on a bare wooden floor. And if she was going to live, maybe, just maybe, he could help her find the strength to continue her journey. The priest moved with careful deliberation, gathering several thick wool blankets from their storage bin behind the altar. The bear's eyes tracked his movement, but she remained motionless except for the rise and fall of her labored breathing. Thomas approached slowly, speaking in low, gentle tones, the same voice he used to comfort frightened children or grieving widows. "Easy, girl," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to calm her or himself. "I'm not going to hurt you. You came here for help, didn't you?" He spread the first blanket on the floor beside her, then carefully draped another over her massive frame. She was even larger up close than he had initially realized, easily 800 pounds of muscle and bone, with paws the size of dinner plates and claws that could tear through steel. Yet she allowed him to cover her without so much as a twitch of protest. Working quietly, Thomas rearranged the front pews to give her more space, creating a makeshift den around the altar area. The bear watched his every movement with those dark, intelligent eyes, and gradually Thomas began to see something that made his breath catch in his throat. She wasn't just allowing his help. She was grateful for it. When he returned with a shallow pan of water from the kitchen, she lifted her head just enough to drink, lapping gratefully at the liquid. Her tongue was rough and pink, startlingly normal for such an extraordinary creature. Thomas found himself smiling despite the surreal nature of the situation. From the church's emergency food supply, he retrieved several cans of salmon and some dried fish that were kept for communion meals. He opened the cans with shaking hands, the familiar task helping to ground him in reality, and placed them within her reach. The bear sniffed cautiously, then began to eat with the careful movements of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in far too long. As she ate, Thomas got his first clear look at her injuries. There were old scars along her shoulder and flank, the kind that came from fights with other bears or encounters with human weapons. But more concerning was the way she held herself, the slight tremor in her limbs that spoke of exhaustion beyond anything normal. This wasn't just a bear seeking shelter from a storm. This was a creature at the absolute limit of her endurance, someone who had traveled far beyond her normal range for reasons Thomas couldn't begin to understand. But as he watched her eat and drink, as he saw some of the tension leave her massive frame, he began to suspect that maybe understanding wasn't necessary. Maybe all that mattered was that she had found her way to someone willing to help. The trust that developed between them over the next hour was unlike anything Thomas had ever experienced. This wild creature, who should have seen him as either prey or threat, had somehow recognized him as sanctuary. And in accepting that role, Thomas felt something shift inside his own heart, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since his early days as a priest. If this moment touched you the way it touched me, show your support with a like. It helps our stories reach more hearts. By midnight, the snow had begun falling again, thick flakes that quickly covered the church windows and muffled all sound from the outside world. The familiar howl of Arctic wind seemed distant and unimportant as Thomas sat in the front pew, watching over his unlikely guest. The bear had finally stopped eating and now lay on her side, breathing more easily than when she had first arrived. Thomas opened his worn Bible to the Book of Psalms and began to read aloud, his voice filling the quiet sanctuary with words of comfort and protection. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." The ancient words felt new and urgent in this context, as if they had been written specifically for this moment. The bear's breathing gradually synchronized with the rhythm of his reading, and Thomas found himself wondering if animals could find the same peace in these words that humans did. Her dark eyes remained open, fixed on his face with an intensity that was both humbling and slightly unnerving. It was as if she understood not just the sound of his voice but the meaning behind the words. As he continued reading, Thomas began to experience something he hadn't felt in years. A direct, personal connection to the divine. Not the abstract theological understanding he had developed through study and service, but something immediate and powerful. Looking at this massive creature who had somehow found her way to his altar, he saw not just an animal in distress, but a living demonstration of faith itself. She had traveled impossible distances across brutal terrain to reach this place. She had somehow known to seek sanctuary in the one building in Utqiagvik that was dedicated to providing exactly that. And she had trusted him, a human, traditionally her greatest enemy, to provide the help she needed. If that wasn't faith, Thomas didn't know what was. The priest's own faith had been tested many times over the years. He had buried children, comforted families destroyed by accidents and disease, struggled to find meaning in senseless tragedies. But tonight, watching this bear find peace in his church, Thomas felt his belief renewed in a way that no sermon or scripture study had ever accomplished. He continued reading until his voice grew hoarse, moving from Psalms to the Gospels, sharing stories of healing and redemption that seemed to resonate in the candlelit space. The bear never moved, never showed signs of restlessness or fear. Instead, she seemed to draw comfort from his presence, just as he was drawing strength from hers. When dawn finally began to lighten the eastern windows, Thomas realized he had spent the entire night in prayer and vigil with the most extraordinary parishioner of his career. And for the first time in decades, he felt truly blessed. As the first pale light of Arctic dawn filtered through the snow-covered windows, something remarkable happened. The bear, who had lain motionless for hours, slowly pushed herself to her feet. Thomas held his breath, uncertain what this movement meant, ready to retreat if her demeanor had changed during the night. But instead of showing any signs of aggression, she moved with deliberate purpose toward the altar. Her massive paws made soft padding sounds on the wooden floor as she approached the simple wooden cross that had watched over Thomas's congregation for decades. The priest watched in amazement as she positioned herself directly in front of the altar and then, in a gesture that defied all his understanding of animal behavior, lowered her great head in what could only be described as a bow. She remained in that position for nearly a full minute, her breathing calm and steady, her dark eyes fixed on the cross. Then slowly, she turned to look directly at Thomas. The intelligence in her gaze was unmistakable, and in that moment the priest felt as though he was witnessing something sacred, not just unusual or remarkable, but genuinely holy. Their eyes met across the small space, predator and prey, wild and civilized, and Thomas felt a profound sense of mutual understanding pass between them. It was as if she was thanking him, not just for the food and shelter, but for seeing her as more than just an animal, for recognizing her as a fellow creature deserving of compassion and dignity. The bear lowered herself back to the floor, but this time she lay facing the altar rather than the door. Her posture was peaceful, no longer the desperate collapse of the previous night, but the relaxed position of someone who had found what they were looking for. Thomas interpreted this as forgiveness. She was offering it to him for the sins of his past, and somehow through her presence, he was finally able to forgive himself. As the morning light grew stronger, Thomas knew that this extraordinary night was coming to an end. The bear's breathing had returned to normal, her strength was clearly returning, and soon she would need to return to her natural habitat. But he also knew that neither of them would ever be quite the same. They had shared something that transcended the normal boundaries between species, something that had changed them both forever. The priest began to prepare for what he somehow knew would be their farewell, gathering supplies and making plans to help her return safely to the wild where she belonged. Where are you watching this story from? Let me know. Our message has no borders. By full daylight, Thomas had fashioned a makeshift sled from wooden planks he normally used for church repairs. The bear watched his preparations with patient intelligence, seeming to understand that he was trying to help her reach a more suitable place to continue her recovery. She was clearly stronger than the night before, but still moving carefully, favoring her injured side. The priest had spent his early morning hours studying maps of the area, identifying a location about 2 miles northeast of town, where a natural windbreak of rocks and hardy Arctic willows provided shelter. It was far enough from human habitation to give her the privacy she needed, but close enough that he could check on her if necessary. Loading the sled with blankets, the remaining canned fish, and several gallons of fresh water, Thomas prepared for what would likely be the most unusual journey of his life. The bear seemed to understand his intentions and, with touching trust, allowed him to guide her toward the door. The morning air was brutally cold, but the wind had died down and the snow had stopped falling. Thomas hitched himself to the sled like a draft horse and began the slow journey across the tundra, the bear walking steadily beside him. She matched his pace perfectly, never straying far from his side, as if she understood they were partners in this endeavor. The journey took nearly 3 hours, with frequent stops to rest and adjust their course. Several times Thomas caught sight of curious faces in distant windows as the residents of Utqiagvik woke to discover their priest walking across the frozen landscape with a polar bear. He knew there would be questions later, probably concerns about his mental state, but none of that mattered now. When they reached the sheltered spot he had chosen, the bear explored the area thoroughly before settling into a natural depression between 2 large rocks. Thomas arranged the blankets and supplies where she could easily reach them, then stood back to observe his handiwork. It wasn't much, but it would provide her with the comfort and nutrition she needed to complete her recovery. The farewell was surprisingly difficult. The bear approached him one final time, close enough that he could feel her warm breath on his face, and for a moment, they simply stood together in the vast white landscape. Then, without ceremony, she turned and began walking slowly toward a grove of stunted trees, her massive form gradually disappearing into the Arctic wilderness. Thomas watched until she was completely out of sight, then stood alone in the silence for several minutes more. The tears that froze on his cheeks were not of sadness but of gratitude, for the privilege of this encounter, for the opportunity to serve, for the profound reminder that grace could arrive in the most unexpected forms. In the days that followed, word of the bear priest spread throughout Utqiagvik and beyond. Thomas found his small church filled with visitors, both locals and curious travelers who wanted to hear the story firsthand. He told it simply and honestly, without embellishment or interpretation, letting people draw their own conclusions about what it meant. Some saw it as a miracle, others as an interesting coincidence. A few suggested that isolation and harsh weather had affected his judgment, but Thomas knew what he had experienced and, more importantly, he knew how it had changed him. His sermons took on a new depth and authenticity as he spoke about compassion, about seeing the sacred in the unexpected, about the thin boundaries between the human and natural worlds. The church began attracting a different kind of congregation, people who had been touched by the story of mutual trust and understanding between traditional enemies. Environmental scientists, native elders, and spiritual seekers found their way to his remote sanctuary, drawn by the message that respect and compassion could bridge any divide. Thomas established a small fund to support Arctic wildlife research and began working with local Inuit communities to better understand the changing patterns of polar bear behavior. He learned that climate change was forcing bears to travel farther than ever before in search of food, often bringing them into contact with human settlements in desperate circumstances. He never saw his visitor again, though he often scanned the horizon hopefully during his daily walks. But every evening as he lit the candles for evening service, he included a prayer for her safety and well-being. In his heart, he believed she had returned to her natural life renewed and strong, carrying with her the same sense of connection that had transformed his own faith. The wooden church continued to lean slightly eastward, battered by Arctic winds but standing firm against nature's assault. But now it carried a new reputation as a place where the impossible could happen, where the boundaries between wild and sacred were understood to be much thinner than most people imagined. If this story moved you, join our Wild Heart community. Click to subscribe, and don't miss what's coming next on your screen. Another life-changing encounter awaits. Father Thomas Ellery continued his ministry in Utqiagvik for 7 more years before age and arthritis finally forced him to retire to a warmer climate. But he never forgot the night that changed everything. Never stopped believing that sometimes the divine speaks not through scripture or sermon, but through the courage of a desperate creature seeking sanctuary. The story of the bear and the priest became part of local legend, told and retold around fires and dinner tables throughout Alaska. Some details changed in the telling, but the heart of the story remained constant. That compassion knows no boundaries, that trust can exist between the most unlikely companions, and that faith often arrives wearing a form we never expected. Years later, researchers would confirm that polar bear behavior was indeed changing, as their traditional hunting grounds disappeared beneath melting ice. The bears were traveling farther, taking greater risks, sometimes approaching human settlements in ways that previous generations never would have considered. Thomas's visitor had been part of a larger story of adaptation and survival that was playing out across the entire Arctic. But for Thomas, the scientific explanations never diminished the spiritual impact of that extraordinary night. Whether driven by desperation, instinct, or something more mysterious, that magnificent creature had chosen his church, had trusted his care, and had given him the greatest gift of his ministerial career: a direct, personal encounter with grace. In his retirement, Thomas often spoke to school groups and church congregations about his experience, always ending with the same message: we live in a world full of miracles, but we have to be willing to recognize them when they appear. Sometimes salvation wears fur instead of robes, sometimes the most profound prayers are wordless, and sometimes the greatest act of faith is simply opening your door to whoever, or whatever, needs shelter from the storm. The wooden church still stands in Utqiagvik, still leans slightly eastward, still provides sanctuary for anyone brave enough to venture inside. The current pastor, a young woman from Seattle, keeps a special candle burning near the altar, not for any official religious purpose, but as a reminder that her small sanctuary once hosted the most extraordinary service in its history. And somewhere in the vast Arctic wilderness, if she survived the challenges that face all polar bears in a changing world, an aging female bear might occasionally pause in her endless search for food and remember a night when she found something even more precious: a warm place to rest and a gentle voice reading words of comfort in the darkness. This is the legacy of one frozen night in Alaska, when fear gave way to faith, when the sacred and the wild discovered they were not so different after all, and when a priest and a polar bear proved that the most profound connections often happen between the most unlikely souls. Hit that subscribe button now, because some stories are too powerful to miss, and you've just become part of a community that believes in the transformative power of love.